Robert Kazami. I'm the Deputy United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York and the Attorney for the United States in this matter. With me is Bill Sweeney, Assistant Director in charge of the New York Field Office of the FBI, and James Robnett, who is the Supervisory Agent in charge of the New York Office of the IRS. Also with me are the prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York who prosecuted the Cohen matter. I'm going to have a brief statement and will not be taking any questions. Today, as you heard, Michael Cohen pled guilty to 8 felony charges. 5 of those dealt with tax evasion for the years 2012 through 2016, in which he failed to report approximately $4.1 million in reported income. Approximately 2.5 of that money was from interest payments from a personal loan that he failed to report. Approximately $1.3 million of that money was from the operation of his taxi medallion business. Approximately $100,000 of that money was from brokerage commissions, and over $200,000 was from consulting fees. That's over $4.3 million over a 5-year period, which translates into a loss to the United States Treasury of approximately $1.3 million. In addition, in count 6, Mr. Cohen pled guilty to making false statements to a financial institution in connection with an application for a home equity line of credit. In that application, he failed to disclose more than $14 million in debt that he had, and as a result of that concealment, he obtained that $500,000 line of credit, which he would not have been entitled to had he been candid and honest. In addition, Mr. Cohen pled guilty to 2 campaign finance charges, one for causing an unlawful corporate contribution, and a second one for personally making an excessive personal contribution, both for the purpose of influencing the 2016 election. In addition, what he did was he worked to pay money to silence 2 women who had information that he believed would be detrimental to the 2016 campaign and to the candidate and the campaign. In addition, Mr. Cohen sought reimbursement for that money by submitting invoices to the candidate's company, which were untrue and false. They indicated that the reimbursement was for services rendered for the year 2017, when in fact those invoices were a sham. He provided no legal services for the year 2017, and it was simply a means to obtain reimbursement for the unlawful campaign contribution. A couple of points I'd like to make. First, these are very serious charges and reflect a pattern of lies and dishonesty over an extended period of time. They are significant in their own rights. They are particularly significant when done by a lawyer who, through training and tradition, understands what it means to be a lawyer, to engage in honest and fair dealing and adherence to the law. Mr. Cohen disregarded that training, disregarded that tradition, and decided that he was above the law, and for that he was going to pay a very, very serious price. With respect to the campaign finance violations, the campaign finance laws are designed to prevent the use of illegal money in elections and to maintain the integrity of those elections. Mr. Cohen made guilty pleas for those campaign violations, and those are core violations. And what he did was, these pleas remind us that it is illegal for corporations to make contributions to candidates, and it is illegal to make contributions in excess of the amount that Congress set for individuals. That is a strong message today, and we will not be, we will not fear of prosecuting additional campaign finance cases. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, this case is unique in many ways. Just witness the gathering of all of you here today. And in other ways, it's unique as well. But in the really important ways, this case is not unlike many cases that my office, the United States Attorney's Office, brings, that the entire Department of Justice brings, and that the law enforcement agencies do as well, including the FBI and the IRS. This case has more in common with all those cases because they all share the same message. And that message is that the rule of law applies, and that for law enforcement, all of whom are gathered here, it is our commitment that we will pursue and vindicate those who choose to break the law, and vindicate the majority of people who live law-abiding lives, who follow honest and fair dealing, and live lives of lawful behavior. The message is that we are here, prosecutors are here, law enforcement is here, the Department of Justice is here, the law enforcement agencies here. We are a nation of laws, and the essence of this case is justice, and that is an equal playing field for all persons in the eyes of the law, and that is a lesson that Mr. Cohen learned today, and it is a very harsh one for him. Thank you very much.
Who is the candidate you're talking about?
I'm sorry. One other thing. I'm sorry. I'd also like to introduce. Sorry, my fault. I really want to thank Mr. Sweeney and James Robnett of the FBI and the IRS and the agents who work for them. We do many cases with them, and their determination and their fair dealing and their vigor with which they pursue their cases is really inspirational. To the prosecutors in my office, I cannot express the gratitude for the hard work that they did in this case, and that is Assistant United States Attorneys Andrea Griswold and Nick Roos and Rachel Maiman and Tom McKay, as well as Ed Discant, the Deputy Chief of the Public Corruption Unit, and Russell Capone, the Chief of the Public Corruption Unit. For all of these people, I could go on and on about their many virtues and talents, but the one important thing is they all are satisfied with simply being known as public servants, prosecutors, and law enforcement agents who are doing their job. Thank you very much.
Can they tell us who your candidate is since you listed them? Can they tell us who your candidate is?
We're listening to one of the prosecutors in the Michael Cohen case. Michael Cohen, of course, Donald Trump's former lawyer, surrendered to the FBI today. He pled guilty, we've learned, to 8 felony charges, 5 or a number of tax charges related to tax evasion, some charges of making false statements to a financial institution, and then these are the key ones in the political sense, 2 charges of breaking campaign finance law. And the prosecutor there had a lot to say about that. He said Mr. Cohen worked to pay money to silence 2 women, of course one of those we know to be Stormy Daniels, and he sought reimbursement for that by submitting essentially false receipts to the candidate, the candidate's business or corporation, namely Mr. Trump's businesses, and they were false because they were marked as being for legal services in a year in which he did not actually do those legal services, according to the prosecutor, and so that means that he obtained that reimbursement in an unlawful way. The prosecutor said that these are very serious charges, that Mr. Cohen disregarded the training that he received as a lawyer, and decided that he was, quote, above the law. And for that, the prosecutor said he will pay a very serious price. He said that though this is a unique case, it's not unlike a lot of cases the U.S. Attorney's Office deals with, in that there's the same message at the end of the day: the rule of law applies, and that the U.S. is a nation of laws. This was about justice, he said, and an equal playing field. Some remarkable words outside that courtroom. Of course, we await to see what President Trump has to say about all of this, because it's not just Michael Cohen that we're talking about. In fact, there are new developments also around Paul Manafort, the man who ran Mr. Trump's campaign for a number of months. There has been a verdict reached in his trial just about an hour ago. He has been found guilty of 8 charges, including bank fraud and tax fraud. A mistrial has been declared on 10 other charges. Now, what's interesting about that is in August 29th, I believe, the judge has reserved until at that point, they won't be sentencing Mr. Manafort. In the meantime, the prosecution has to decide whether or not they're going to pursue another trial on the 10 other and the 10 other charges. So we're also waiting to see what Mr. Trump has to say about that. He's actually scheduled, he has taken off, I believe, and is scheduled to attend a rally shortly. There are no scheduled comments to the press, but of course, as has been the case many times when Mr. Trump flies various places, he does end up talking to the press about these. So just to recap again, we've got breaking news south of the border. And we've got Steve Niles standing by out of Toronto to talk us through some of these amazing moments in U.S. politics. Steve, I think you're with us now.
Yes, I am, Vashi.
Hey, Steve. So we've just heard from prosecutors in the Michael Cohen case. What stood out for you?
A fairly remarkable situation in that courtroom today where, according to the scuttlebutt that I've been hearing, I unfortunately couldn't hear that lawyer you were just speaking to, but the scuttlebutt that I've been hearing is this is one of the first times that Donald Trump has personally been implicated in anything. Oh gosh, I don't know what to call it, any of the latest news over the last couple months with this Russia probe, Mueller investigation, that sort of stuff. Cohen in that courtroom today saying that he was acting on behalf of a candidate for federal office, presumably in this case Donald Trump, also implicating him in that Stormy Daniels hush money payment. So that fairly remarkable. The things as well that we heard out of their courtroom today, pleading guilty to 8 counts, 5 of which were tax fraud. 1 was lying to a financial institution. And those last 2, the really interesting ones as well to me, were the campaign finance ones. And this is related to the Stormy Daniels money. So a fairly remarkable day on the Michael Cohen front. Vashi?
And then, of course, we've got Paul Manafort and the verdict reached in that trial. Take us through what you know about that.
Yeah, this one fairly remarkable as well, and it's incredible that these are happening on the same day. There was 18 counts that he was facing, mistrial on 10 of these charges, so 8 guilty counts there, mistrial on the other 10 counts. So what's going to be interesting for prosecutors in that case is whether or not they want to continue to go after those charges. Sentencing, I should say, sentencing for both Cohen and Manafort, not today. For Cohen, they've held it off to December, I believe. For Manafort as well, what they're waiting to know on the sentencing there is whether or not prosecutors want to go after those 10 counts in which the jurors could not reach a unanimous verdict. Vashi? And
ultimately, in the Manafort case, Steve, sort of pundits and people looking at it from the outside were saying this is the first real test of the Mueller investigation. So if it is the first test, what does this say about that?
So far, so good, I think one would presume in this case. What they don't really have at this point, though, which a lot of people would be looking for, though, is any level of cooperation from these individuals. Now, they've gone through different paths, I guess you could say, to where they get to where we are, whereas Cohen pleading guilty and accepting a plea deal, whereas Manafort's going ahead and he went to trial at this point. So the lawyers that we've been speaking to on this network and that I've been seeing speaking on other networks and on Twitter are talking about whether or not at this stage either of them are going to change their tune on levels of cooperation. So let's take Paul Manafort, for example. He's guilty on 8 of the 18 counts. Is that enough leverage for him to possibly spill the beans if he knows anything else? For Cohen's case, he has this plea deal and he hasn't been sentenced yet. So what does that mean when it comes to any possible cooperation? At no point today have we heard in either of these cases that either of them are preparing to cooperate in any way, shape, or form. As for Mueller at this point, he's gone forward. I guess if you include Papadopoulos in this as well, it seems that his track record is fairly unblemished at this point.
I'm just reading on the wires here, Steve, that the U.S. Senate's number 2 Republican, Senator Cohen, says Manafort, Cohen verdicts do not implicate the president at all, particularly on the Russia investigation. These are the first sort of reactions out of Capitol Hill. You know, that statement, I imagine, will be interpreted different ways.
Yes, and that was from Manafort, you said, right?
He's saying Manafort and Cohen verdicts don't implicate the president at all, particularly on the Russia investigation. I'm reading that right off the wires, yeah.
Okay, and politicians will speak as politicians do. Remains to be seen. We need to remember, too, that campaign finance violations are not the same as colluding with a foreign government to perhaps influence an election. So we need to sort of remember that these are separate issues at separate times. While the politicians will spin it the way that they do, what Cohen directly tied the president to in that courtroom today was an illegal campaign finance violations. I believe the number is $130,000 to Stormy Daniels to buy her silence about an alleged affair, an affair the president denies. Also at play right now as well are Paul Manafort's dealings with foreign governments and money that he got and allegedly kept overseas as well. Does this tie the president to the Russia, to the KGB and manipulating election hacking? I think the politician in this case that you quoted there is probably correct in that regard. However, and we were talking about the Mueller probe, in this case, we are still, by many accounts, according to the pundits, in the early stages. It feels like it's been going on for a while, but Watergate went on for a lot longer than this as well. So this could just be the first, salvos in this ongoing battle.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks a lot, Steve. Really appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
We're continuing to track two breaking stories out of the U.S. this hour, both involving key former members of Donald Trump's inner circle. First, Paul Manafort, the man who for several months ran Trump's presidential campaign, has been found guilty of 8 charges, including bank fraud and tax fraud. A mistrial has been declared on 10 other charges. Then, over in New York, President Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, has surrendered to the FBI and has pleaded guilty to tax evasion, bank fraud, and campaign finance violations. Cohen admitted in court that hush money paid to a former Playboy model was intended to influence the election. So what does this all mean for President Trump? Joining me now from Washington is Kenneth Vogel, Washington correspondent for the New York Times. Hi, Mr. Vogel. Great to see you again.
Hey, Vashi, good to be with you.
Okay, so what in all of this, and there is a lot, what stands out for you as the most significant, especially where President Trump is concerned?
2 key counts that Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to involving campaign finance violations. In both cases, he said that these payments were arranged to these women who had alleged that they had affairs with Donald Trump in coordination with the campaign and the candidate to help the campaign. That is basically implicating Donald Trump in a criminal federal campaign finance violation. We don't know necessarily if there will be charges brought, but that is the takeaway from that. That is a huge deal. It is the closest, it is an actual allegation of wrongdoing against the sitting president of the United States. For all the attention that the Paul Manafort trial got and for the degree to which it really fixated Donald Trump's attention, there were never allegations of wrongdoing related to either the campaign, let alone the president. In one fell swoop this afternoon with Michael Cohen's plea deal, we have the allegations of wrongdoing right up to and including the president of the United States. The significance of that cannot be overstated.
So what happens now?
We don't know. Michael Cohen, we assume, is probably cooperating with prosecutors, and as such, anything that he tells them could be used to build a case, either in the Southern District of New York. It's actually important to note here that Michael Cohen's case was handled not by Robert Mueller's team, but by prosecutors in New York City, to whom the case was referred by Mueller. And so there was some question as to whether the case involving Michael Cohen would sort of stray far afield from Donald Trump. Here this afternoon, we have proof that no, it did not stray, and in fact is focused to some extent on Donald Trump. This gives prosecutors, both Mueller's prosecutors and working in conjunction with the prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, a great deal of leverage, not just with Michael Cohen, but even with the developments in the Paul Manafort case. It is true, he has been convicted, but he has not been sentenced, and there will be additional pressure on him, potentially, from prosecutors to see what he might be willing to do in terms of cooperation to get a recommendation for a less stringent sentencing.
Do you think Cohen's guilty plea means he's cooperating with Mueller? Or he will be?
It certainly seems that way. To come in, to have a guilty plea even before there is an indictment in the case. He had not been charged. We were just kind of speculating as to what the investigation was centered on, based on our sources telling us, but we didn't have anything on paper from the prosecutors. So to skip that step of conviction, of an indictment, let alone to even start the process towards a trial, would suggest that he has had extensive conversations with the prosecutors to reach this point, and you would have to think that those conversations would involve what he could do for them in exchange for him pleading guilty, giving them this huge victory without having to go to trial.
Staying on Mueller's investigation, how significant do you think the Manafort verdict is today for that investigation?
It is a huge symbolic win in that there had been a ton of attention on this trial. It had been very public. It was sort of the first time that Mueller had been forced to show his cards publicly to a jury and to the media as to what his investigation had found into a key subject. But it's important to remember that these allegations and the counts on which Paul Manafort was tried and then the counts on which he was convicted today were not related in any way to the campaign or to Donald Trump. So it's a victory for him, certainly from Mueller, and it does potentially give him leverage to get cooperation from Manafort if the Mueller team deems that it would be helpful in building a case against people around Trump or related to the Trump campaign. But as far as actually pointing the finger of blame, of allegations of violations of federal campaign law or any law at Trump, the Cohen guilty plea so much more significant than anything we've seen in the Manafort case.
Trump has a rally tonight. President Trump has a Make America Great Again rally tonight. Do you think he's going to comment? If so, what do you think he's going to say?
I mean, he has been absolutely fixated on this case. On the Manafort case, we've seen him publicly comment. It was a rare departure, something that's frowned upon for a someone in law enforcement, let alone the chief law enforcement officer of the United States government, to be commenting on a case that is pending before a jury. But Trump did just that last week, saying that Paul Manafort was essentially getting a raw deal, and it's a shame about what's happening to him. If he was thinking and saying that last week, it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't articulate some of his displeasure or some of his thoughts and emotions around the Manafort case at this rally. And then we also know that he and his lawyers thought that Cohen was potentially a greater threat, and they were really bothered by Cohen, and Trump himself had come out and teed off against Cohen. So again, it's hard to imagine him avoiding articulating his thoughts on this subject that we know has been a huge distraction and focus for him over the last many weeks and months since we found out that Cohen was under federal investigation.
I know the news is just rolling out, but how is it being received there? And I noticed on the wires, I was just looking a few minutes ago and talking with a reporter, the Senate's number 2 Republican says Manafort-Cohen verdicts do not implicate the president at all, particularly on the Russia investigation. How do you expect it to play out in Washington?
I mean, it's huge. I turn off my phone to talk with you, but the number of press releases and groups and members of Congress and politicians who wanted to weigh in on this is just overwhelming. This is absolutely captivating Washington, D.C. It's a huge development to have 2 huge developments almost at the same time in this case that has just preoccupied Washington for the duration of the Trump administration, even before Trump took the oath of office. It's a bombshell in the truest sense of the word.
So what are you looking for, I guess, over the next 24 and 48 hours on both these fronts?
I mean, we'll be looking for any indication that Michael Cohen is cooperating. I don't know if we would necessarily see it. That's part of what makes today's developments so riveting, is the fact that Mueller and the Mueller team and the prosecutors working sort of alongside him in the Southern District of New York have been so tight-lipped. It's been so difficult to figure out what they're up to. We got a little bit of a taste of it in the Manafort trial. We got a huge taste of it with the Cohen indictment, the Cohen guilty plea. So we'll be looking to see what types of moves we would see in potentially other cases. There are some cases where we've seen them put off their sentencing recommendation, including in the case of the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. There is some developments in the recommendation for sentencing of George Papadopoulos, another campaign advisor who's pled guilty to lying to investigators. So we have a lot of moving parts here, and it's like we don't hear anything, and we're kind of clamoring for any little details, and then all of a sudden there's this dam breaking, and we have all these details and are trying to process them and figure out what it means for what might be happening next.
All right. Well, I know you probably have a very busy night ahead of you. Thanks for making time for us, Mr. Vogel. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Vashi.